After the devastating failure in the Battle of Stalingrad, Adolf Hitler finds himself in a desperate situation. Obsessed with defeating the Red Army, he desperately seeks a quick solution to change the course of the war on the Eastern Front. Hitler faces the reality of a war that he can no longer fully control. Despite his desperate attempts, Germany's ability to maintain its momentum begins to significantly weaken. The war becomes a struggle for survival for the Third Reich, as the Allied forces advance from the west and the Red Army gains ground in the east. Nevertheless, despite this resounding failure, the counteroffensive developed by Germany during the Battle of Kharkov in the spring of 1943 enables the Wehrmacht to regain lost ground in the Donetsk Basin and directly threaten the Soviets in the Kursk salient. Dubbed Operation Citadel, the German High Command, pressured by Adolf Hitler himself, approved a new summer offensive on April 15, 1943, starting from Orel in the north and Kharkov in the south, supposedly encircling the Kursk salient to pocket and destroy the numerous Soviet armies concentrated there. For this purpose, the German army would rely for the first time on new technological acquisitions in tanks. Specifically, the armored Panthers and Tigers, the latter equipped with an 88mm gun in the turret, which far surpassed the previously feared Russian T-34s. These tanks were joined by the usual Panzer III and Panzer IV, in addition to the newly introduced 62-ton self-propelled Ferdinand and similar Elephant. The same applied to the modern models incorporated into the Luftwaffe, as the ever-present Messerschmitt 109 fighters and Stuka dive bombers were supplemented by the innovative Henschel 129 aircraft converted into tank destroyers. The Army Group Center under the command of Field Marshal Günther von Kluge and Army Group South led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein would be the two wings tasked with surrounding Kursk from the northern and southern sectors towards Svoboda and Oboyan respectively, maintaining full confidence in the element of surprise and the technological superiority of the new tanks and aircraft. "It's time to write the last will," bitterly noted an SS assault soldier in his diary on July 5, 1943, as he awaited the order to advance. Along the line, Soviet soldiers shared their own jokes, like the one about the tank crewman who reported that almost everyone in his unit had fallen that day. "Sorry," he remarked, "I'll make sure they burn me tomorrow." Hitler named his plan this way, arguing, "This operation is of fundamental importance. It must conclude with rapid and decisive success. Every commander and every soldier must be properly prepared to realize the decisive importance of this offensive. The victory at Kursk will be a beacon that will illuminate the world." The only thing left to decide was the timing of the start and the precise locations, which Soviet intelligence had been unable to determine. Adolf Hitler had repeatedly postponed the date. At least 3 times the Soviet High Command, known as the Stavka, had issued false alarms. Then, on the evening of July 4, 1943, the Germans sent their men the unmistakable signal, a special ration of brandy. An Alsatian serving in the Waffen-SS promptly deserted and convinced a team of high-ranking interrogators, including the commander of the Voronezh front, General Nikolai Vatutin, and the 49-year-old political commissar Nikita Khrushchev, that the German offensive would be launched before dawn on July 5th. Granting the Germans the advantage of tactical surprise could prove fatal. Khrushchev quickly informed Moscow. Joseph Stalin returned the call and, according to Khrushchev, asked for his opinion, to which he replied, "We will make the enemy pay in blood when they attempt to advance." Scheduled for 5:30 in the morning on July 5, 1943, 3 hours before the German offensive was unleashed, at 2:20 in the morning, the Soviets, who knew the enemy's plan in advance and were aware of the German positions, preempted their opponents with a powerful bombardment of artillery and Katyusha rocket launchers. Caught completely by surprise, the large concentrations of German troops waiting to rush the Russians were heavily punished by thousands of tons of fire and lead. Quickly the German front lines dissolved, and casualties began to mount alarmingly, preventing any coordinated offensive for the planned dawn assault. Until 3:30 in the morning of that July 5th, 1943, the German army did not respond to the Soviet bombardment by concluding counter-battery fire with thousands of cannons against all identified enemy positions. Consequently, just as had happened an hour earlier, the Soviet troops were pounded by German artillery, suffering very high casualties, and countless cannons and vehicles were destroyed. Meanwhile, as thousands of projectiles fell between the lines, hundreds of German sappers infiltrated no man's land, crawling to the Soviet lines, cutting the barbed wire, and cleaning minefields so that tanks could move at dawn. Just before the first rays of light dawned on July 5th, 1943, both Luftwaffe and Red Air Fleet aircraft attacked each other along the entire front, bombing troop concentrations and airfields on the steppe. German fighters Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf Fw-190 strafed dozens of Soviet aircraft on the ground. Officially, at 4 in the morning on July 5th, 1943, the major ground offensive against Kursk began when the German 9th Army under General Walter Model launched an attack against the Soviet armies positioned between Bryansk and the Central Fronts. With German infantry protected by new Panthers and self-propelled Ferdinands, the initial assault was a disaster as well-protected Soviet troops in trenches destroyed numerous German tanks with explosive traps and dynamite charges, while machine gun nests and mortars decimated the infantry. Only the deployment of powerful Tiger tanks from the 20th Panzer Division tipped the scales in favor of the Germans, as the 15th Rifle Division was driven out of the Oka Valley with significant losses, allowing the Wehrmacht to occupy Oka itself, seize the city of Butiriki, and destroy all anti-tank guns and T-34 tanks in the area. Simultaneously, the 48th Panzer Corps initiated Operation Citadel by charging against the steppe front at Cherkaskoye. This assault initially ended in failure as the 200 German tanks were immobilized by a minefield swept by enemy artillery. However, the situation turned in favor of the Germans when the Soviets made the mistake of leaving their positions and were slaughtered by the new Panther tanks. Once the Russians were decimated, reinforcements from the 48th Panzer Corps and Panzergrenadier Division Großdeutschland allowed the advance to continue, overwhelming the Soviet lines with significant casualties for the Red Army and capturing the city of Cherkaskoye. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, comprised of the veteran divisions Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, headed towards the Kursk salient, traversing minefields with astonishing ease and encountering Soviet troops from the 52nd Guards Division and 375th Rifle Division. The Tiger tanks, accompanied by lighter armored vehicles and Hanomag half-tracks escorting infantry and grenadiers, surpassed enemy defenses, broke through anti-tank barriers, destroyed Russian guns guarding the area, and dissolved the sector of the front, facilitating penetration inland. Less successful was the offensive led by Group Kempf, the 2nd Panzer Corps, and Corps Raus, as the Germans, after advancing 5 kilometers, were halted by the frantic resistance of Soviet artillery and became immobilized, unable to advance or retreat in the Belgorod Hills. Even the counter-battery fire from the self-propelled Ferdinands proved ineffective in reversing the situation. So the infantry had to continue alone with a bayonet charge that ended in a bloody hand-to-hand combat between the Soviets and Germans, fought with pistols, knives, shovels, and even punches and kicks, with no clear winner. As the evening fell on July 5th, 1943, the Battle of Kursk improved significantly for the German troops when they occupied the important enclave of Alexandrovka. Almost simultaneously, just before nightfall, the 3rd Panzer Division operating in the Cherkaskoye area managed to flank the River Pena with the aerial intervention of 100 Stuka dive bombers, annihilating the 71st Soviet Guard Division during the maneuver. This unexpected last-minute victory dealt a heavy blow to the Red Army, resulting in 8,300 casualties. With the first defensive belt of the Red Army occupied by the German army on the day following the start of the Battle of Kursk, on July 6th, the Soviet General Staff ordered the mobilization of all reserves due to the gravity of the situation. That morning, they organized a counterattack using T-34 tanks on Olkhovatka, but the assault ended in a complete fiasco as the tanks were easily destroyed by the vastly superior Tigers of the 2nd Panzer Division. Moreover, once the enemy attack was thwarted, over 1,000 German tanks launched an offensive, advancing in a wedge formation with the Tigers at the front, followed by Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks on the flanks, which overwhelmed all Soviet units in their path and captured the city of Soborovsk. Again on July 6, 1943, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps charged against a new sector of the Kursk salient. This time, the Voronezh front, where the 6th Guard Army was stationed. As in other instances, the invincible Tigers and Panthers breached enemy lines, seized the village of Luki, captured the Yakovlevo crossroads, destroyed an entire Soviet regiment, and split the 6th Guard Army in half, leaving it isolated. However, despite the incredible success of these veteran Waffen-SS troops, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps had to halt its advance, because the rest of the forces tasked with protecting their flanks, namely Group Kempf and the 2nd Panzer Corps, were unable to advance beyond the Belgorod Hills due to the tenacious resistance of the Red Army. On July 7, 1943, the Red Army unleashed a second offensive on the outskirts of Poniri, which also ended in a disaster as 2 armored T-34 corps were annihilated by German tanks. With the Soviets repelled, German troops attacked the city of Poniri, defended by the 307th Rifle Division, gradually driving them out of the city after intense close combat in the suburbs. It only took one morning for the Germans to occupy Poniri, except for its railway station, which continued to resist thanks to the arrival of countless trains loaded with soldiers who miraculously managed to keep the installation in Soviet hands despite the enemy's futile assaults, earning it the nickname Kleine Stalingrad, or Little Stalingrad. Meanwhile, in the sector of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, things were no better for the Red Army as the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, destroyed 75 Soviet T-34 tanks, and the Das Reich destroyed another 50 tanks of the same model after being expelled from North Luchki. Very slowly but progressively, the German army advanced in the Kursk salient, as demonstrated by the Totenkopf Division on July 9th after occupying the village of Yakontovo. Similarly, things improved on July 10th when Group Kempf, which had recently received reinforcements from the 4th Panzer Army, finally managed to break through the Belgorod Hills and attack towards Korocha, where it destroyed 2 entire Soviet divisions and captured a general along with his entire staff, dealing a heavy blow to the Red Army, especially after Voronezh Front Command counted only 100 tanks remaining out of the 646 with which the campaign had begun. Interestingly, starting from July 11th, the Soviets had to resort to a tactic of burying 100 T-34 tanks underground, leaving only the turret exposed to act as mobile bunkers due to the enormous losses suffered in tanks. However, despite the effectiveness of this technique in pulverizing numerous German armored vehicles, the offensive launched that day by the 2nd SS Panzer Corps with the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf at their forefront, covered from the air by squadrons of Stuka dive bombers and Henschel H-129s, disrupted the Soviet lines and destroyed countless Russian tanks. This allowed the Germans to advance 40 kilometers and capture the villages of Berezov, Gremuchi, Bikovo and Voznesenki, and to cross the river Psel by laying a 30-ton pontoon bridge, positioning themselves at the gates of Prokhorovka. In fact, in the sector of the 6th Panzer Division under General Franz Bake, a detachment of German soldiers disguised as Russians and aboard 2 captured T-34 tanks seized the only intact bridge over the river Donets at Rzavets, briefly trapping the 69th Soviet Army. The village of Prokhorovka was a state farm called Komsomolets, situated in the midst of the Ukrainian steppe, spanning a 15-kilometer front from the Psel River in the north to Belenikino Station in the south. Surprisingly, and perhaps by the whims of fate, both sides chose this area to carry out simultaneous offensives on July 12, 1943. Hauser was ready to execute. His orders for July 12th were direct. No more nonsense. This time, the Panzermatra would be applied. Klotzen, nicht kleckern. Clout, not splash. However, this did not entail a massive frontal assault with 3 divisions at the same time, plunging into the jaws of Russian cannons. Hauser envisioned a sequential operation to be carried out as follows. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte at Oktabruska Farm, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich at Teteverino, and the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf at Vasilevka. Meanwhile, the 5th Guard Army under General Pavel Rotmistrov, consisting of 310 tanks and 472 aircraft, with the 18th Tank Corps at Andrevka and the 2nd Guards Tank Corps at Vinogradovka. Such a situation set the stage for the definitive event of Kursk. The tank battle at Prokhorovka. All the elements of myth were at hand. Prokhorovka offered a frontal and direct confrontation between the elite troops of the world's best armies on a 5-kilometer front under conditions that left no room for sophisticated maneuvers or for air and artillery forces to play a significant role. The drama was heightened by a familiar image of both sides attacking simultaneously, a literal clash that suggested predators in heat. Prokhorovka provided an emotional turning point. After this, nothing would be the same. Following this, the tide of war swept in only one direction: Berlin. At 8:30 a.m. on July 12, 1943, German tanks Panzer, Tiger and Panther of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte began to move across the green plain of Prokhorovka towards the Storozhevoye forest, while Soviet tanks T-34, T-70, KV-1 and Churchill did the same towards Hill 252.5. With the cry of Stahl, 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 or Steel, 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 the 5th Guards Army charged head-on, supported by a 15-minute barrage of artillery fire that had no effect, as well as waves of Sturmovik IL-2 aircraft that also failed to hit the enemy. Due to these aiming errors, as soon as the German tanks had the Soviet T-34s in their sights, at 800 meters away, they opened fire and set numerous enemy tanks ablaze. Around 9 a.m., more than 500 tanks from the 5th Guards Army clashed with those of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. Although the German tank crews were blinded because their eyes were facing the sunlight coming from the east, and therefore the T-34 spread out in a fan formation to threaten the superior Tiger and Panther tanks and even collided with them to damage them. By 10 a.m., the first Russian wave withdrew, having lost 20 tanks at the cost of virtually none for the Germans. Although the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf suffered a 50% breakdown in their heavy tanks, which were quickly made operational again. The second wave, launched at 10:30 a.m., also had no effect because the T-34s became stuck in an anti-tank ditch under Hill 252.2, which the Russians had dug beforehand, allowing the German tanks to fire at a concentrated enemy until they pulverized 60 enemy tanks without any losses of their own. Regarding the flanks of the central sector of the Battle of Prokhorovka, the tanks of the 6th Guard Army were annihilated by Nebelwerfer rocket launchers and a grouping of the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf, which with their Tigers destroyed 60 T-34 tanks between the Psel River and Vasilevka. Involved in the battle on the German side were the highly praised Tiger tank commander Michael Wittmann, as well as Rudolf von Ribbentrop and Standartenführer Joachim Peiper, alongside his top man from the Leibstandarte, Werner Wolf. In the face of incredible energy and determination, Wolf made the bold decision to take command of a company that had been left without a leader after its commander was killed. With unwavering determination, he quickly took control of the chaotic scene. Wolf's leadership shone brightly as he swiftly organized a formidable defensive front. He rallied his grenadiers and available personnel, and in the face of the enemy's relentless assault, strategically deployed close combat teams against tanks, displaying exceptional tactical order. His quick thinking and determination were crucial in averting further chaos and instilling a sense of order among his beleaguered comrades. Furthermore, amidst the chaos of battle, Wolf managed to save his self-propelled combat vehicles from certain destruction as they burned and exploded. Wolf's force of personality transcended mere leadership. He became a force of nature that not only restored the fighting spirit of exhausted grenadiers, but also instilled them with a bitter and unyielding determination to prevail. The momentum that the relentless hostile attack could not overcome amidst the chaos of battle, Wolf personally faced a T-34 tank in hand-to-hand combat. In this encounter, he skillfully eliminated the enemy tank, further solidifying his reputation as a fearless and formidable warrior. But Wolf's valor didn't end there. The tank commander emerged from the flaming vehicle and confronted Wolf, both engaged in a bitter man-to-man struggle amid the battle. However, he executed a daring feat by using his own dagger to kill the enemy general commanding. At the age of 22, Ribbentrop described in his memoirs, "It was a hell of fire and smoke, the destruction of the T-34 tanks, with all their dead and wounded." Tank crews, like pilots, can recount heroic stories. Ribbentrop's could be titled 7 Panzers against 50 T-34s at Prokhorovka. During the first minutes, at least, their 7 Panzer IV suffered a debacle of targets, trying to shoot at the flanks against relatively thin armor, each tank covering another. They were incinerating the Russians within 100 meters of firing range. The only question was whether their ammunition or luck would run out first. Ribbentrop's own tank was overlooked in the midst of the Soviet charge. He found himself surprising the tanks and infantry on the Russians from the rear as he fought to return to his starting point, ultimately emerging victorious from a death duel with a T-34 at cannon shot distance. On Hill 252, the Russians invaded the headquarters of a Panzer Grenadier battalion of the Leibstandarte. Its commanding officer, the famous Joachim Peiper, personally disposed of a T-34 with a handful of hand grenades, which was not a usual task for a senior officer, even in the Waffen SS. Ribbentrop's crew also bought time for the other 2 companies of the Leibstandarte tank battalion to deploy in support of their pressed infantry. Undoubtedly of greater significance, Ribbentrop's resistance allowed the Tiger company of the division to take positions, aiming down on Hill 252 and covering the October State Farm. The vanguard brigades of the 18th Tank Corps were tasked with breaking through the left flank of the Leibstandarte, still wide open in the absence of the Totenkopf panzers. Initially, 4 Tigers blocked their advance. One of them was commanded by an SS hero even more iconic than Ribbentrop. The legends surrounding Michael Wittmann obscure the fact that, even at this early stage of his career, his comrades considered him unique for his situational awareness and cool-headedness. This made him the right man in the right place when hundreds of Soviet tanks advanced towards the October State Farm. Starting at distances of 1800 meters, the Tigers methodically liquidated one T-34 after another, and there were very few Tigers to offer a target to the supporting Russian artillery. Erhard Goers, a soldier under Peiper's command, said, "It was hell." After the battle, the cultivated field east of the trench was like a tank graveyard. Following this latest setback, and just as the Russian tanks collided and were pulverized between the cornfields and crops at the foot of Hill 252.2, the German aviation gained air superiority and, with its tank hunters, Stukas and Henschel HS-129s, finished off the day by annihilating the last Soviet armored vehicles over a total of 893 sorties. By the evening of July 12, 1943, the 5th Guard Army withdrew completely defeated from the Battle of Prokhorovka, considered by experts as the largest local tank confrontation in history. Up to that point, the Red Army had suffered 5,500 casualties and the destruction of 334 tanks, with 420 damaged, while the German Army only incurred 522 casualties, including 97 dead and 425 wounded, in addition to 6 destroyed tanks and 41 damaged. However, small-scale advances continued. From 10:45 p.m. onwards, the Totenkopf felt comfortable enough to report that its panzer group had reached the Kartashevka-Prokhorovka road. With a day's delay and a severe shortage of men and tanks, On the map, only a few kilometers separated the Totenkopf from the road leading to the rear of the Voronezh front. By that time, the Panzergrenadier companies of the Totenkopf had been reduced to 50 men or fewer. So exhausted after days of close combat that the standard stimulants were having the opposite effect. The armored regiment had lost almost half of its tanks, fighting to break out of the Psel bridgehead. 45 had been destroyed or damaged, including all of the Tigers. The crews of the remaining 56 Panzers were exhausted. Fuel and ammunition were scarce. Although only a few of the damaged tanks were permanently lost, the maintenance teams were on the other side of the Psel. Bringing both their men and vehicles towards or pulling the tanks back meant challenging higher priorities of food, gasoline, and ammunition in one direction, or the evacuation of the wounded in the other. The bridges remained vulnerable to air attack and the still existing possibility of a surprise enemy advance. The original command cadre of the Totenkopf came from concentration camps. Its first commander, Theodor Eicke, had spent time in a psychiatric hospital, which was not a usual step towards high command, even in the Third Reich. It is not surprising that the division's spirit was to get the job done at any cost. Imagination was not a valued virtue, so when, on the night of July 12th, the Totenkopf expressed concern about Soviet forces, and the number of reinforcements seemingly arriving by the moment when it began to intensively prepare for an even stronger attack in its still reduced bridgehead, it was a clear sign that the SS Corps had come to a complete halt, at least in the minds of those bearing the brunt of the day on the Soviet side and reading decoded radio intercepts. On the night of July 12, Manstein thanked and praised the SS divisions for their outstanding success and exemplary conduct. Reports of the Soviet tank losses and first-hand accounts of what had happened to them further reinforced Manstein's belief that the odds were good and the Reds were bleeding out. The actual situation warranted a more subdued mood. Hoth was nervous. His two main corps had been heavily hit on the front by the Russian tanks, whose numbers far exceeded the original concern that had led Hoth to plan the SS return towards Prokhorovka in the first place. Neither subsequent intelligence reports nor reconnaissance prepared the command of the 4th Panzer Army for corps and tank armies that seemed to materialize from the very forests and steppes. The personnel losses of the day were not paralyzing in themselves. The SS counted around 200 dead and missing, likely dead. But the number of wounded was much higher. Only the Leibstandarte reported 321 wounded, most in the tank and rifle companies. And to repeat the universal funeral song of Citadel, nothing could replace the veterans, platoon and company commanders, tank commanders and non-commissioned officers who increasingly sacrificed themselves, assuming suicidal risks to compensate for the reduction in skill, energy and morale in the exhausted and manpower-starved units. Since the 5th of July, the SS tankers and Panzergrenadiers, riflemen and artillerymen had been pushed to the mental, emotional and physical limit by the nature and intensity of the fighting. A good number of men, even among the ranks, were lightly wounded or concussed, but preferred to stay with their uniforms rather than an overworked medical evacuation system. The combination of humid heat and torrential rain also took its toll. Thirst to the point of dehydration was a special problem for the tankers. Food, if any, with something hot, even coffee, was a welcome anomaly. The universal constant, however, was the lack of sleep. Against all odds, on the morning of July 13, 1943, and despite the slow progress of the German army toward the Kursk salient, Adolf Hitler ordered the suspension of Operation Citadel. The reason for this surprising decree was the Allies' invasion of Sicily through Operation Husky, which forced the Third Reich to divert a large part of its resources to a much more strategic sector, such as Italy, and its continued involvement in the conflict following the landing of US and British troops. These events led to the entire 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which had just thwarted a Soviet offensive in Prokhorovka by destroying 150 enemy tanks without any losses, being transferred from Kursk to the Italian peninsula, including elite divisions of the Waffen SS, which prevented any offensive action and led to the cancellation of Operation Citadel on the Eastern Front. On the same day, July 13, 1943, when the German High Command cancelled Operation Citadel, the Bryansk Front took advantage of the German weakness in the withdrawal to unleash a counteroffensive with tanks and infantry led by the 11th Guards armies. The wise intervention of the panzers led by General Model quickly repelled the Red Army's attack and stabilized the lines. At the same time, on July 14, the dismantling of the ground gained since July 5 began, while the 2nd Panzer Army covered the retreat. During this operation, the Germans repelled various counterattacks from both the Bryansk Front and the Voronezh Front on July 17, at least until the counteroffensive launched by the 11th Soviet Army, which penetrated more than 70 kilometers inland without capturing any German units because they were all evacuated, forcing all Axis divisions to retreat beyond the Dnieper River. In the early hours of July 23, 1943, the vanguards of the Red Army reached the starting lines of the German Operation Citadel, initiated on July 5th. With this final episode, the Soviet Union and Germany concluded the Battle of Kursk.